Last year, I posted a video about a quest to turn one of my favorite computer monitors in recent years, the one usually attached to a Microsoft Surface Studio, into a standalone monitor that could be plugged into a modern PC. I loved the idea of using a square monitor because, for most of what I do, 16:9 is a little narrow. It doesn't matter if it's horizontal or vertical, it just never feels like I can get as much out of it as I can with something squarer. And as far as something squarer goes, it's hard to beat the 28-inch 4.5K screen on the Surface Studio. Pretty much since day one, people have been talking about how nice this screen is and how much they wish they could use it on any computer they wanted, even trying to pull it off to varying levels of success. I threw my hat into the ring, figuring out how to disassemble it, and installing a new AliExpress board to drive it from DisplayPort and HDMI. And for a month, everything seemed great. Until one day the board died and the company refused to refund it. Desperate to make this work, I bought a second board hoping it was just a fluke. But this one was broken straight out of the box. And after losing several months and hundreds of dollars on this project, I'd kind of lost my appetite for pursuing it any further. With my square monitor dreams seemingly dead in the water, I instead decided to try a 32:9 ultrawide. Which I understand might seem incongruous. I mean, I went from saying my monitor was too wide to getting a monitor that was even wider, but my rationale was rather than treating it like one wide monitor or two 16:9 monitors, I could treat it like three squarish monitors side by side. For the most part, this does work pretty well. And while it can be nice technically having a completely seamless triple monitor setup, there are also downsides to tiling over individual monitors. The OS doesn't see them as separate monitors, so you don't get separate taskbars or spaces for each one. The ultrawide's DPI is also not quite as good, but it was capable of a refresh rate up to 240Hz, which was really nice. Overall, I was reasonably satisfied with the setup and saw no need to change it anytime soon. Even though BenQ apparently had the same idea around the same time and made a 3x2 monitor of their own, I concluded its specs weren't quite as good as the Surface Studio or even my ultrawide, so I didn't go for it. But since my video, a company called Kuycon released a monitor with precisely the same specs as the Surface Studio, and I was immediately intrigued. For the record, I did know this was possible. The Surface Studio panel isn't exactly off the shelf, but it's made by Samsung, and it's not impossible for non-Microsoft factories to get their hands on them. In my original video, I even asked a factory in China if they could make standalone monitors around that panel, to which they said they could and even quoted me a per unit cost to manufacture them. I briefly considered setting up a Kickstarter or something, but even I wasn't sure what kind of market really existed for these things. I mean, hell, even Microsoft gave up on selling the Surface Studio. Though, pretty much the one thing everyone said when it was discontinued was the screen was the best part and they wish it had been spun off into its own thing. So maybe there is a market. I guess we're putting it to the test now. Having attempted to build one of these myself, I was extremely curious at how someone else had approached it. I wasn't necessarily looking for a new monitor, I was still pretty satisfied with my ultrawide, but I definitely wanted to check it out and see what it was like. Being a Chinese product, it can be purchased from several online storefronts. However, the only official retailer in the US and Europe is a company called ClickClack. I asked if they would be interested in sending me a review unit, and they said yes. Before I knew it, I was the proud owner of a Kuycon P20. Yes, they sent it to me for free, but they have not otherwise paid me or obligated me to say anything specific. These are all my own personal thoughts and opinions. I just wanted to know what it was really like, so let's find out. So here it is, and right off the bat you can tell exactly where their design influence came from, and ironically it wasn't Microsoft. No, this bears a striking resemblance to the Apple Pro Display XDR, complete with a thick cheese-grated design and extremely similar stand. Before Apple replaced it just a few weeks ago, the Pro Display XDR sold for about $5,000, and infamously cost another $1,000 just to get the stand. ClickClack sells the whole thing, including the stand and Visa mount, for just under $800, placing it pretty squarely in the high mid-range of monitors, where people have a little bit of money to throw at nicer gear, but not, several thousands of dollars. The monitor has most of the features you'd expect in this price range, such as a very high resolution and DPI, 10-bit color depth, 99% DCI P3 coverage, and HDR, though it's that fairly shallow form of HDR that sounds good on paper, but isn't actually very useful. As we've established, the DPI is actually a step above what you usually see in this category, which, after all, is what made the Surface Studio so appealing in the first place. Though what you gain in resolution, you lose in refresh rate. It caps out at 60Hz, where at this price point, most monitors are providing 120Hz or more. I do realize that this is not a gaming monitor and is instead designed for productivity where refresh rate isn't seen as that big of a deal, but I would argue it still makes a big difference even when you aren't gaming. And in a world where high refresh rates are becoming widespread even in laptops and smartphones, 60Hz just feels a little disappointing for something that's supposed to be on the higher end. Anyway, since it's clearly supposed to fit into the Apple aesthetic, let's hook up an Apple computer. At first, I was a little confused because it didn't turn on by itself. The Apple Pro display, in very Apple fashion, has no buttons or controls. They just power on when they get a signal and all settings are configured through the operating system. But this obviously only works because they know you'll be using an Apple computer. So what we have here is one of the very few deviations from Apple's design.
Is there a button? Oh, there are buttons on the bottom!
It's actually only one button for power. To access the settings, you have to use this included remote instead. I'm personally not the biggest fan of this. I mean, I get the point, it does legitimately clean up the design, but the remote looks kinda cheap and plasticky, and I just know I'm gonna find a way to lose this one day. Other than that though, my first impressions are very good. The picture quality is stunning. This is exactly what I and many others were talking about when we said we wanted a Surface Studio monitor. I can't complain about the build quality either. Both the monitor and stand feel very solid and sturdy. It's definitely better than anything I would have DIY'd myself from a used Surface Studio. And unlike the board I was using, it doesn't blow up after fiddling with the settings. I still can't believe that happened. Speaking of settings, the menus are noticeably different from the ones on the board I was using. I mention this because I half suspected them to be using exactly the same parts I was, but no, these have been refined and have custom Kuycon branding. I also noticed the bezel is noticeably thinner than the Surface Studio. I point this out because my understanding was the front glass was actually part of the panel, so the fact that the glass is different does suggest some kind of custom manufacturing step. I'm pleasantly surprised. It's not just off-the-shelf stuff crammed into a nice case, there has been some effort put in here to make this a real product. While the display is certainly impressive, the sound is a little less so. It makes a barely audible hiss when the screen is on. In fact, even when turned off, it still makes a high-pitched buzzing sound when it's plugged in. To be fair, it's only really noticeable if your ear is close to the back, but I suspect if you were in a quiet room, you'd just be able to hear it. I do remember the board I was using in my version had a fan, so I wouldn't be surprised if this did too. That might have even been the motivation to adopt the cheese-grater design for better ventilation. It had always been my plan to try and find a passive cooling solution, but my project was cut short before I could. Speaking of sound, I noticed the monitor has a volume control, but it doesn't have any built-in speakers. Not that I have any need for a monitor with built-in speakers, but I was curious about what the volume control was for then. Well, it turns out the monitor has a 3.5mm jack on the back, I guess for headphones, but it does seem a little inconvenient if you're sitting at a wired headphones distance to have to pick up a remote and point it at the screen to change the volume. I guess for some people it might be useful to have the port right there, though anyone buying this monitor could probably afford a less janky audio setup. Speaking of ports, it has pretty much all of the inputs you would hope. HDMI, DisplayPort, and USB-C are right here on the back. However, in practice, I found it's not that simple. USB-C just didn't work. It didn't matter what computer or cable I tried, it just wouldn't show up as a monitor in any way. That being said, the USB-C charging and hub functionality did seem to work, as long as you know which port is which. It's not labeled, but there is a diagram on the website. But that wasn't all, I had trouble with HDMI too. It is true that for a resolution this high, the computer must support HDMI 2.1, which, despite being almost 10 years old, still sees iffy support to this day, especially on Linux. Even so, I could not for the life of me get a refresh rate above 30Hz at full resolution over HDMI. It didn't matter what OS I was on, what GPU I used, what cable I used, it just could not seem to do it. I learned you can set the HDMI version in the monitor's settings, but it was already set to 2.1 out of the box, and changing it to 2.0 just limits the resolution to 4096 by 2160, still at only 30Hz. The only way I could get the full 60Hz refresh rate over HDMI was to switch the resolution down to standard UHD, but that kind of defeats the whole point of this monitor. So in my experience, the only port actually worth using is DisplayPort. That's the only one where you get full resolution and full 60Hz. And while that's perfectly fine for me, not everyone is going to have easy access to DisplayPort, so it's a bit of a concern unless it's just my unit, which is certainly possible. Anyway, while once again I wasn't planning to replace my ultrawide, I figured the only way to really test it would be to use it as my main monitor for a while. I've now been using it for a little over a week, and I have to say, there is just something about it. The vibrant color and contrast, the squareness, the DPI, everything just looks good on it. I thought the noise might be a deal breaker, but I honestly can't say I've really noticed it on my setup, again, unless I put my ear right up to it. And sure, while it isn't as immersive as a wide or ultra-wide screen, the picture quality makes games look pretty good. Especially older games, since 4x3 fits a lot better on this than a standard widescreen. You ever see an old arcade cabinet where they've replaced the CRT with a mediocre LCD? Well, while not the cheapest thing in the world, if you're gonna do that, this monitor, with its aspect ratio, high DPI, and vibrant color, would probably be one of your better options. Honestly, it might even give the CRT a run for its money. But it's not all positives. Like I said, the HDR capability is pretty shallow. I personally wouldn't really bother with it. It is also a glossy screen like the Surface Studio, which has its pros and cons. It definitely improves the picture sharpness, contrast, and vibrance, though it can also be distracting seeing my reflection depending on the lighting of the room. Backlight bleed is okay. It's not super noticeable during regular usage, but it is there. To be honest, this was true of the Surface Studio too. It's a known downside of an edge-lit backlight like this. That being said, I don't know where this red patch is coming from. But once again, the biggest thing I wish this monitor had is a higher refresh rate. I know for a lot of people this wouldn't be that big of a deal, but once you've gotten used to a higher frame rate like me, 60Hz feels like watching a PowerPoint presentation. It just makes the whole system feel slower and less responsive. I'm also a little concerned about the technical support. The monitor came with a USB flash drive containing manuals, but it's all in Chinese, so not super helpful to me. As I've been testing, I've also been asking the team questions, and while they're very nice, I didn't get a lot of straightforward answers. I tried asking about the USB-C and HDMI issues, and I had to tell them 3 separate times I was using a GPU that supported HDMI 2.1 before they got it, at which point I was asked to send the complete configuration of my tested computer. But what does that mean? What configuration? I already said what GPU I was using. Similarly, I asked about repairability, mostly because I wanted to see what the inside of this thing looked like, and while at first I was told it should be convenient to open and tinkle with, when I asked how to take it apart since there are no visible screws anywhere on it, they corrected that they don't recommend disassembly as it is pretty complicated. That doesn't surprise me. I kind of figured it would be glued together like the iMac and Surface Studio, but their lack of knowledge about the product was not entirely encouraging. I wouldn't necessarily call this a deal breaker, I just don't know whether issues like that HDMI problem are an intended part of the design, a flaw in my unit, or some kind of user error. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like they're entirely sure either. I also couldn't confirm where these panels came from. I mean, if they are rejected Surface Studio panels, there's a chance they have defects like dead pixels or discoloration. I'm hoping that's not the case and they're either old stock or a clone panel manufactured from scratch. I just don't have that information. I'd recommend exercising caution, as with any non-established brand, and making sure wherever you buy from has a good returns policy. For the record, ClickClack seems to be fairly reputable in this regard. But with all that in mind, I would still call this a very nice monitor, one of the nicest I've ever used. I have to say, I'm not feeling any pressing need to go back to my ultrawide. Yes, I missed the high refresh rate, but other than that, I'd say the overall picture looks better on here. It's worth noting that BenQ just released a new version of their 3x2 monitor, and it actually does run at 120Hz. And since they're a name brand company, their monitor might have better quality control and technical support. That being said, as we've established, its other specs aren't quite as good. It's targeted for coding rather than graphics work, so pick your poison. Ultimately, while it isn't perfect, there's a lot to like about the Kuycon P20. For all those people who dreamed of having the Surface Studio as a monitor, I'd say your prayers have finally been answered. Hopefully this video helped you decide whether this is something you're interested in, or whether there was a deal breaker you didn't know about before. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.